You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in. We were really
a Mamamia podcast.
It was an ordinary September morning when Beverley Bass flew over the Atlantic Ocean at the helm of an American Airlines flight from Paris, France to Dallas, Texas, with 158 passengers on board. Beverley was enjoying her morning. The skies were clear right across the Atlantic, something that very rarely happened. But then, completely out of that bright blue sky, Beverley's world changed. In fact, the entire world changed, because it was September 11, 2001, and this had just happened.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
Unbeknown to Beverley and her co-pilot, one of the planes that had crashed into the towers was actually another American Airlines jet crewed by people that she and her crew all knew and had flown with. Things happened quickly after that. Beverley was ordered to land her plane immediately. From Mamamia, you're listening to No Filter, a podcast where people from all walks of life tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. My name is Mia Friedman. When you think of September 11, chances are you don't think of good news stories. What happened that day is etched into the minds and hearts of people all over the world. It changed the way we lived and travelled fundamentally, but it also gave us the story of a little town in Canada that did some pretty extraordinary things in the face of international terror. It's a story that's been turned into a musical called Come From Away, but before it was a Broadway smash, it was the story of Beverley Bass. And on this 20th anniversary of September 11, Beverley joins me now from Texas to share it. You're an absolute pioneer in terms of being a female pilot. What was the year that you started working professionally as a pilot?
Well, I started flying in 1971, and I got my first job. I was a flight instructor and a charter pilot, probably about 1973. But what I really credit as my first job was flying for a mortician out of Fort Worth. And so it was my first regular job. I was hauling bodies. And no, the airplane was not big enough for a casket. It was one body at a time on a stretcher that sat right beside me. Well, they were lying down, but they were right beside me.
I'm glad they weren't sort of sitting up, Weekend at Bernie's style, because that would be awkward.
Right. But, they were good because they'd all been embalmed. He was not a fellow who worked at a funeral home. He was an embalmer. So they had all been embalmed, which means all the fluids were removed and all of that. So, they didn't move around or make noises or groan or any of that. So that was good.
Where were you flying them to and from, Beverley?
Well, the gentleman who owned the airplane kept it at our flight school in Fort Worth, Texas. So I would deliver a body to their family. Possibly they died in Fort Worth, and I would fly them all around the 5-state area to like Arizona, Oklahoma, Arkansas, just wherever they needed to go. Or it could be the reverse. I would fly empty to a city, pick the body up, and bring it to Fort Worth to deliver it.
Would you ever talk to the dead bodies?
Nope. I never had any conversation with them. And to be honest with you, I was always happier when they were out of the airplane. I loved flying the airplane just empty, without the bodies.
I think that's pretty understandable.
Yeah.
Being a female pilot in 1971, for younger women who don't know what it was like back then, what was it like? Because that's pretty groundbreaking. I can't think of many female pilots that would have been around at that time.
No, there weren't very many. And the flight school that I worked at in Fort Worth is a very large airport. And I was the only female pilot who was actually working. I mean, there were others who were getting their pilot's license, but I was an instructor. And I was chief pilot of the charter department. I was flying the bodies. And then I flew for 2 corporations. And then eventually another girl became a flight instructor at a competing flight school, which was right next door to ours. And it was so odd because we would each walk to the flight line with our students, and we would never look at each other. We would never talk to each other. And we later became friends. As a matter of fact, we ended up being roommates and living together. But she always said she was so intimidated by me, and I was the same way. I was like, oh my God, she's a better pilot than I am. I'll never be able to talk to her. And we both had the same feelings about each other. Isn't that so odd? It wouldn't be like that today. We would run up to each other and say hello, I'm sure.
Yeah. Back in the 70s and even the 80s and probably into the 90s, women were flight attendants and men were pilots. There were no male flight attendants and there were very few female pilots. When you expressed a desire to fly, did people try to encourage you to be a flight attendant?
Well, I think that's what people assumed that I would want to be. And I will admit that there was a time where I actually thought maybe if I started out being a flight attendant, I could work my way into the cockpit. Because when I had the desire to fly, there was no such thing as a female airline pilot. We also couldn't get into the military as pilots. And I wanted to fly the biggest airplanes I could fly, and those airplanes belonged to the airlines. So I was very fortunate that the door opened up in 73. The first female pilot was hired in the U.S. Her name was Emily Howell Warner, and she was hired by Frontier Airlines. And then American actually hired the next girl 2 months later, but she only flew for 8 months. And then because of the oil crisis, a bunch of pilots were laid off for the next 2.5 years. So she was hired way before me in 73, but she wasn't that much senior to me because we were hired in late 76 after those laid off pilots were called back. So I was just honestly in the right place at the right time. The doors started opening when I was qualified, and that made it perfect.
You said you wanted to fly the biggest plane you could. When you're a pilot, is like that seen as the pinnacle, the most challenging plane to fly? Like, what is it about a big plane?
Well, it's not that it's harder to fly or anything like that, but it's usually a little bit more sophisticated navigation-wise. And most pilots with the airlines don't get to fly international flights until their seniority permits. It's starting to change a little bit where they fly international early on, but I didn't get to fly international. I started in 76 and I started flying international in 1990. So I'd been with the airline 16 years before I had the seniority to fly international. And of course, that means the big airplanes. The little airplanes don't fly international unless you consider the Caribbean or the Bahamas international, which it's really not.
Do you get paid more to fly a bigger plane?
Yes. We get paid by the minute and we get paid by the gross weight of the airplane. However, that being said, there are some pilots who really don't ever want to fly international because your circadian rhythm gets messed up. You're flying on the backside of the clock. And, some people really choose not to ever do that. They want to stay domestic in the United States. But I loved flying international. I loved Asia. I flew Japan a lot and all of Europe and South America.
When you're preparing for a flight, like you're flying the next day, is there anything that you do? I mean, I imagine you don't drink a lot the night before. You need a good night's sleep. What's the preparation that a pilot does before they do a long-haul flight?
Well, sleeping is the most important thing. And our flights are very different. Like if you're going to Asia, you leave in the morning, like say 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. And since you're flying westbound, it is daylight the whole 13 hours of flying. When you fly to Europe, it's very different. We launch out of the U.S. in the evening. They all launch out of Chicago, Miami, Dallas, New York in the late afternoon, anywhere from 2 till about 8 o'clock in the evening. So just a couple of hours into our flight, it's already dark. So you start out in the daytime, you fly through the night, and you arrive in Europe at about 7 in the morning. And even though that's only midnight, our body time, it's 7 a.m, people are awake, they're drinking coffee, and you sort of have to go to the hotel and get a few hours sleep. So it's all about managing your time. But as far as preparing for the flight, no, there's not one thing that you have to do. Our manuals are all electronic now, so you have to make sure that everything is updated. But the wonderful thing about our job, and my husband used to tease me about this all the time because he worked in headquarters and there was no end to his work. He could bring mountains of homework home. He said the really cool thing about your job is you walk off that airplane and there is not one thing you can do to make your next flight better. And he's right. So you never take your work home, which is pretty nice.
So the morning of September 11, when you boarded that plane that you were flying from Paris to Dallas, it was an ordinary day?
Completely. As a matter of fact, it was extraordinary because it was clear all the way across the Atlantic, which it normally isn't. It's usually cloudy. And it was actually a training mission for me because the co-pilot was on his first trip in the 777 and I was the instructor pilot. So he got a little more than he bargained for on his first mission. Most people don't get to divert and stay in the city for 5 days. Most people don't get to jettison fuel, and he got to do all of that. So it was a very interesting trip, especially for him.
How long had you been in the air before you knew there was a problem?
About 3.5 hours, because when you're in the middle of the North Atlantic, it's about 3.5 hours into the trip. And that's where we learned that the attacks had occurred. But, recognize we didn't know any details. We didn't know what airliners. We didn't know they were airliners. We didn't know they'd been hijacked. We didn't know any details. And we were only getting sporadic information from a couple of airplanes that were actually farther westbound. And we monitor an air-to-air frequency when we're over in international waters because we're out of range of air traffic control. So we don't really have controllers to communicate with. It's just pilots talking to pilots. And we were getting our feedback from the airplanes in front of us. And that's really all we knew. It was pretty vague.
So someone came over the airways and said a plane's hit the World Trade Center. And what did you think straight away when you heard that?
Well, we immediately thought it was a small airplane, and not that that's not tragic, of course it is, but it never entered our minds that it was an airliner. I mean, that wouldn't even be a thought. And then shortly thereafter, when we heard the second airplane had hit the second tower, with that came the word terrorism and airliner, and that was a game changer. I mean, things got serious at that point.
I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and I remember really vividly that over that time there were a lot of hijackings of planes.
Yes.
Can you explain what happened during I can't believe I'm going to say the word traditional hijacking, but what was that time like to live through as a pilot?
Well, it was quite different because recognize the cockpits were not breached. The hijackers did not take control of the aircraft. They did not murder the pilots. It was just they ordered the pilots to land in a specific city. They claimed to have had bombs with them. They claimed to have had bombs in the belly. And so they coerced the pilots to go to places. Whereas this situation was so different. I mean, who would have ever imagined that they would get into the cockpit in the first place? And then the poor pilots were defenseless. They're sitting there with their seatbelts on, their shoulder harnesses on. They can't even turn around to defend themselves. But at the end of the day, their throats were slit with box cutters and they were helpless. They were defenseless. And we've never had a situation like that ever.
When you were a pilot during those times of the planes being hijacked, and I remember watching news coverage of these planes being diverted to airports, and then the terrorists would take all the passengers and the crew hostage and then make demands.
Yes.
And then ultimately they would be overwhelmed by authorities, and few lives were lost to my memory. Is that correct?
Yes. And we actually have hijacking procedures in our flight manuals. We have specific things that we are supposed to do and directions we have to follow. We didn't have any procedures for what happened on 9/11. We do now, but that's like closing the gate after the horse got out.
What were the procedures for the kinds of terrorist attacks you were anticipating back then?
Well, back then, the ultimate plan was to not go where the hijackers wanted you to go. And you used a lot of excuses like, you didn't have enough fuel, you couldn't get fuel, and things like that. You had very specific places on the airport where you had to park the airplane in the event of there being a bomb in the cabin or in the belly. So we had very specific procedures to follow, unlike 9/11.
So you're in the air, you're hearing that it's terrorism. What do you do? Did you think, what if there's someone on my plane?
It's funny. People have asked me that before, and quite honestly, that never entered my mind, and I don't know why. I can't even tell you why it didn't. What was important to me at the time is I had to get the airplane prepared for a diversion. We had to program our computers. I had to communicate with the flight attendants because I had to make a PA to the passengers. And remember, I'm behind a locked cockpit door. It's the flight attendants who I have to protect and be very cognizant of. So I decided what I was going to say in my PA. I wanted to say as little as possible, but I had to be truthful. I didn't want to make up a mechanical situation that we were landing in Gander for and then have to undo it on the ground, because I think especially as a female pilot, it would make me lose credibility, and I didn't want that to happen. So I formulated my PA, I wrote it down, I brought the lead flight attendant up, I had her read it. She said it would be fine. I made the PA, and it was fine. She didn't have any problem with the passengers. But I guess we were so busy, I never thought about somebody in the back of my airplane. And I guess the other thing, and we didn't really know this at the time, but they weren't international airplanes that were attacked. They were all domestic East Coast airplanes heading to the West Coast. So we were not one of those.
Who gave you the instructions that you had to get out of the sky?
We actually came in contact with Gander Control, and that happens at 50 degrees west longitude as you approach it westbound up over northern Canada. And it is who we talk to on every normal crossing coming back home. So as soon as we talked to them, they said, American 49, land your airplane immediately in Gander, Newfoundland. And that's what we did. And that's kind of unusual in itself, because as airline pilots, we don't get orders. If we're going to divert one of our airplanes, which we do practically every day, we coordinate that with our dispatchers. Nobody tells us where to go. They might give us options, but at the end of the day, it is the captain's ultimate decision where he's going to put that airplane down.
How did you know how to get to Gander? Do you just kind of enter it into your sat nav? Like, do you just type in Gander?
Yes, that's exactly what you do. We have very sophisticated computer-based nav on the airplane, and you literally type in Gander. You actually do the 4-letter identifier. It's CYQX. See, I still remember it.
I'm sure you do.
And then you program that in the computer and then tell it to go direct to. And that day, when we put it in our computer, I was 7,000 pounds over my max landing weight. And you can land the airplane overweight, but if you choose to do that, you have to have a very specific inspection done by a trained mechanic. And so I opted to jettison the fuel, and I landed at my normal landing weight. And it was interesting because when we touched down in Gander and got parked, the Canadian officials came on the airplane, and the very first question they ask is, did you land overweight? And I said, no. And they said, thank you. So I guess I was 36 out of 38 wide bodies to land that day. And I'm guessing quite a few landed overweight, which made more work for them. So it was a good decision.
What's the bad thing about being overweight?
Because of that inspection that has to be done. Not any maintenance person can do it. They have to have special training to do that inspection.
So when you said before you were locked in the cockpit, like, did any extra security happen? Like, did the pilot start saying, hey, they've stormed cockpits, you need to double lock your doors?
No, we didn't know any of that. No, it was probably 30 hours after the attacks before we learned what really happened. It was the first time that we were able to see the images on TV. And I would say it took me almost a year to formulate in my mind which airplane hit which tower first. I now know that it was us. It was American that hit the North Tower first.
The airline you worked for.
Yes, I never saw it in real time. So it was a long time before I could actually process whether it was American or United in the North Tower or the South Tower. But I know now.
So many of us watched that happen live, and then over the next 30 hours before you'd even seen it once, we'd seen it hundreds of times. Watching it as a civilian, obviously everybody was filled with horror. How could you not be? What was it like to see that as a pilot? How was it different for you to how it might have been for us as civilians?
Well, sure. What made it different for us is we all knew somebody on one of the airplanes, and we all, I'm sure, put ourselves in the same position and tried to imagine what we would have done. Although, knowing the details of it today, I don't know of anything that anybody would have done differently. Obviously, the procedures have changed drastically since that day. All the cockpit doors are reinforced. They're all bulletproof. They have codes to get in. And the pilots can't even come out of the cockpit to go to the restroom without calling the flight attendant. They have to put a food cart to block the entrance to the galley and the cockpit so that passengers can't breach the cockpit. And then a flight attendant has to sit in the cockpit while the pilot goes to the restroom. So procedures have changed quite a bit. It makes us never want to leave the cockpit. And we fly 13-hour legs.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you'd want to just not drink anything and maybe install a catheter.
Right.
Before you go.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It'd be easier, believe me.
Absolutely. It's funny when people might be listening to this and saying, but why didn't the passengers know? Like, why didn't you see it? This was a time before most people had cell phones and there were no smartphones.
Oh, no. Crew members certainly did not travel with cell phones because I think it was about $100 a minute to call home from Europe. So none of us had cell phones. A few passengers on my airplane did have cell phones, but there was no way to charge them. So they were all running out of battery power. And it wasn't until about 4:30 in the afternoon on 9/11 that I was actually able to borrow one of the first-class passengers' cell phone to call home. And it was the first time I had talked to my family the whole day. And my kids were young. They were 9 and 10. The schools were on lockdown. My husband came home from work, which is 45 minutes from their school, and picked them up. And, they were terrified. They knew I was flying, but they didn't know where I was. I knew where I was. I knew I was okay. My family did not know that.
Your husband, was he told that you were safe on the ground?
Well, he tried to call American, which was kind of ridiculous. I mean, we just lost 2 airplanes. You weren't going to be able to call American. But I had a really good friend, a captain who had retired the month before. So Tom reached out to him and he said, let me work on it. Tom said, I just need to know where she is. That's all I need to know is where she is. So he got a hold of the powers that be and he called Tom back. He said, Tom, I can't tell you where she is. And it's not because I know and I can't tell you. He said, I don't know. He said, I can tell you that her airplane is on the ground and is safe.
Okay. Because when we were watching it unfold, I remember, learning on the news that there were thousands of airplanes in the air. And at that time, they didn't know how many had terrorists on board.
Right. And they have since learned that there were multiple airplanes that had them that you don't know about.
More than the 4 that crashed.
Oh, yes. Yes, I have friends that have stories, and I've talked to people in the FBI, and yes, there were multiple airplanes that never got to fulfill their mission that day. Thank God the airplanes were grounded when they were. It was the smartest move that could have been done.
Getting them out of the sky, because it's true.
Absolutely.
I feel so for your husband and for all the families of pilots and passengers, because as we watch, it's like are we going to find out that there's going to be crash in Paris and in London? Is this...
Yes.
It felt like the end of the world watching it unfold, but you were almost blissfully unaware.
Blissfully unaware. Perfect terminology.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with Beverley Bass about September 11. I'm not familiar with Gander or Newfoundland. Where is that? And is it a big airport? Is it a big city?
Well, I wasn't familiar either until I went there for 5 days. Now, I have since been back 6 times. Newfoundland is an island, and a lot of people don't realize that. And Gander is a very small community. It had a population of 9,400 people. We showed up unannounced in 3 hours and nearly doubled the population of their tiny town. We were nearly 7,000 passengers and crew. The airport is actually quite large. Runways are long and substantial and very nice. Actually, it was built by the U.S. State Department during the European theater during World War II. So the U.S. built the airport, and the community was established as a result of the airport. And everything is about 2 minutes from the airport. I think they have 2 stoplights in town. It is so small. They don't have an infrastructure, no big hotels. They have motels with a total of 500 rooms, and that's it. That's it. Nicest people in the world.
And where were all the planes from? You said there were 38 airliners, so big jets and jumbos. Where were they from?
Yeah, they were all jumbo jets, wide bodies. Well, they were all mostly coming in from Europe. And I don't know if there were any that were actually eastbound from the west, but we were all westbound from all over European cities. I think they had passengers from 90 countries or something in the airplanes. I mean, they were from everywhere. I mean, even my airplane, I was just going from Paris to Dallas, but, there were 4 or 5 languages spoken on the airplane. So a real mixture of people.
You mentioned when you made that public announcement, the captain is the boss of the plane, right? So you're responsible for the crew, you're responsible for the passengers.
Yes.
I've also heard you say that passengers often tune out a female voice because we're conditioned to believe that it's not the captain, it's actually the flight attendant.
Honestly, I think that still holds true today. I really do. If you don't start your announcement by saying, "This is Captain Bass," they tune you out. It's just human nature. Unfortunately, we've been airline pilots now since 1973. I don't even know how many years that is, but it's a lot. And we still only represent 6% of the airline pilot population. So our numbers are still very small, very small.
So you have a responsibility. You mentioned before that you wanted to make sure that announcement protected your crew. Do you mean that because they're the passenger-facing representatives, I suppose, what were you worried that the passengers might do in terms of the crew?
Well, remember, I'm sitting behind a cockpit door that is locked, and I've told the flight attendant it's not to be open for any reason. It is the flight attendants who are really the first line of defense. I mean, if the passengers are going to try to do something nefarious, they have to get beyond the flight attendants first. I have a barrier. I'm locked behind a door. So I didn't want to say anything that would cause panic or any kind of ruckus in the cabin. I needed my flight attendants to be protected, and that was at all cost.
So you're on the ground. There's thousands of passengers, 38 enormous planes, a small town. What happened next?
Well, we landed at about 10:15 in the morning on September 11th, and when we got parked, the Canadian officials came on the airplane and they said, "You won't be getting off until sometime tomorrow." So we knew we were in for the long haul. We were going to be there all day, all night, and we didn't know what time we were getting off the next day. So the flight attendants sort of planned the last meal service to be dinner for the passengers. So they passed out blankets, pillows, fed them dinner later in the afternoon about 5 o'clock, and put movies on. So they were very well behaved. The weather was beautiful. We were able to open the aircraft doors and put the barrier straps up so that people could at least look out and, feel fresh air. And the Canadians delivered everything to the airplane. They delivered diapers, formula, smoking patches, Nutri-Grain bars, water, and they even fed all the animals in the belly. I didn't have any animals, but there were a lot of animals on the airplanes. And, the passengers just took it in stride. The crew stayed awake all night. We listened to the BBC, which was our only form of news that we were able to get on the aircraft radios. So we were getting London's version as to what was happening in the US, and we just stayed up all night listening to it. We actually deplaned around 7:30 the next morning. And then we walked into the terminal, which was full of food. Every stove in Gander had been turned on. They made enough food to feed 6,700 passengers and crew that walked off the airplanes. There were tables and tables of hot food.
That's just unbelievable. Before you got off, what did people do about the toilets?
We had 8 labs on the airplane, and actually 4 of mine were up. Unfortunately, it came to me from Kennedy in New York to Paris with 4 of them shut down.
Oh.
But I wasn't full. The airplane holds 247 passengers, and I only had 156. And the Canadians emptied the labs on all the airplanes, so it was not a problem.
And what about the people who, you mentioned smoking patches? I hadn't even thought about that, the smokers on the plane. What about other people who needed things like medication?
They filled 2,000 prescriptions throughout our stay on the airplanes and while the people were in Gander. They filled over 2,000 and did not charge anybody for anything.
These people sound unreal, these Ganders.
I know. It's an unimaginable story. And when I left Gander on September 15th, I remember looking at my crew and saying, oh gosh, I just want the whole world to know the Gander story. And, we went for years, and then the musical was written by David Hine and Irene Sankoff. And guess what? The world now gets to know the story of Gander.
How did you get out? Like, once everybody was in Gander, where did people stay?
Well, they had them everywhere. They closed their schools for 5 days. So they were in the schools, churches, fire station. Most of the crews were in motel rooms. They wanted us to be able to have sufficient rest because we never knew when we were going to get the call to go home. And so the passengers stayed anywhere and everywhere within a 200-mile radius. As many as 10 were in people's homes. They didn't speak the same language. It was incredible. But they were taken fishing and hunting, hay rides. They fed them moose burgers. They had barbecues. It was like, you can't even imagine. It was crazy.
Like the most beautiful juxtaposition to the despair everybody was feeling and the terror, literally, of what had happened and the tragedy. And then there was this extraordinary act of human kindness that you were marinating in.
Oh, for sure. There have been lifelong friendships formed as a result of it. And like I said, we've been back to Gander 6 times. I've taken my family, my whole family back. I always wanted my kids to go. I wanted them to know where I spent those 5 days because I knew that 9/11 was always going to be a historical event.
No one was allowed to fly for quite a few days after 9/11.
4 days.
When it was time to go, where were all your passengers? Like, did they all have to come back with you to Dallas?
Oh, yes. When they got off the airplanes, they were registered by the Red Cross. It was imperative that they keep each airplane together. We were not with our passengers, but all my passengers were together at the Knights of Columbus Lodge because when you left, you had to have the exact passengers leave with you that you came in with, or they wouldn't let you go.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, if you were missing passengers, they pulled the bags out of the belly and blew them up. because that was indicative to them that there could have been something nefarious on the airplane. So no, there was very strict protocol. And then when we got the call to leave, it was 11 o'clock at night, and we got to the airport at midnight. It took 6 hours to get just my airplane through security. So we didn't actually leave until 8 o'clock in the morning, and we hadn't slept at all. But we as a crew had to remove every piece of china, silverware, and glassware off the airplane. And the passengers were given boxed lunches for the flight to Dallas. And that's not normal for us. I mean, we don't remove that stuff off the airplane, but we did that day.
Because I guess that was the big shock too. Like when there had been these terrorist attacks in the 70s and the 80s, terrorists had somehow managed to smuggle on guns. But what made this different was that it was just box cutters, like little things that...
Yes, little things.
Little things.
Yes.
So you had to keep your passengers together. Did you have to persuade any of them to not just try to get out of Gander and just like jump on a boat, get on a... I don't know how else you could get out.
Well, every day I went over to the Knights of Columbus Lodge and briefed them. I didn't have anything to tell them because nothing changed in 4 days, but they wanted FaceTime with the crew. And I would always take a few flight attendants with me who spoke the languages that were on the airplane, especially French. And I begged them not to defect. I made it very clear to them that if we did not leave with every single passenger, what would happen to the rest of the bags on the airplane? They would be removed. And
blown up.
Yes. So they were great. I didn't lose anybody, but I was emphatic and I begged them every day, please stay. And in reality, it's a little tough to leave Gander. There was one liaison for every airplane that landed there that day. And the person for me happened to be a fellow by the name of Pat Woodford, who was an air traffic controller. And he was responsible for coordinating any information between my passengers and me as a crew and coordinating food and all of that. And he gave me the keys to his brand new truck. He had just gotten this truck and he handed me the keys and he said, here, you can use this while you're here. I said, but you don't even know me. And he said, well, where are you going to go? You're on an island. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I guess you're right. So yeah, we've laughed about that a few times since.
Beverley, the idea of a musical about September 11 and it being a happy story is confusing to some people until they've seen Come From Away. How did the musical come about?
Well, I think the writers would tell you that they couldn't possibly have written a play without music because Newfoundland is all about music. Part of the reason for that is that the weather is so harsh and their winters are so difficult that they have what they call kitchen parties. And they all migrate to each other's homes. And everybody there can sing and dance and play multiple musical instruments. So their life is a very happy musical life. And they said there was no way to write this show without music. And I just think they wrote a masterpiece. And I do have a lot of people who were very closely connected to the events of 9/11, especially people who lost family members or crew members on the airplanes. And I always try to explain to them that they will love the show. I mean, there are a couple of sad moments. There would have to be, or it couldn't be a true story. But they never let you dwell in those moments of sadness. It immediately moves to something funny or happy, and all of a sudden you forgot that 30 seconds ago you were kind of sad. And I just think it's such an uplifting musical, and if you aren't a better person when you walk out of that show, something is missing.
So true. It filled my heart, that show, watching it. I absolutely loved it. Beverley, just finally, do you still fly?
I do. I've been flying a jet that's privately owned for about 4.5 years. The jet is owned by an 84-year-old woman who still works, and we fly her all over the U.S. and Canada. And we just took on a second partner, and now I am flying more than I flew with American. So yes, I'm getting ready to be 70 years old, and I'm still flying jets, I'm happy to say.
You're an absolute inspiration, and I don't use that word lightly, not just because of September 11, but because of what a pioneer you are and a role model for women in aviation. And it's just been such a delight to talk to you. I've just loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a story. She must have told that story a lot of times, but she's so engaging and delightful to speak to. And if you possibly can, I thoroughly recommend you get yourself to a theatre whenever you can to see Come From Away if it's playing in your town. It is such an outstanding story and one of the best musicals you'll ever see. Thank you for listening to this episode of No Filter. You can also join me, Holly Wainwright and Jessie Stevens on another podcast that I'm on called Mamamia Out Loud. It's different to this one. It's not an interview podcast, but we talk about all the things that women are actually talking about. And you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. The assistant producer of No Filter is Lucy Neville. The executive producer is Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on the Mamamia app.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.